Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 27th, 2023.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the opportunity of speaking in this beautiful conference. And thanks for everyone who's present and the ones that are on Zoom as well. So I'm gonna share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So I'm going to talk about indigenous spiritualities, and I make this question about cultural appropriation, or if they are actually the last salvation. And indigenous spiritualities are definitely in the air. So since I'm originally from Brazil, but now I'm based in the UK, and since I moved here, I observed an enormous interest of Europeans in Amazonian indigenous traditions and in their medicines as well. And it's for sure something that it's growing among many Westerns, not just in Europe, but all around the world. And today I will present some ideas in terms of the genealogy of such boom, looking specifically to the cases of the Yawanawa and the Hunniquen peoples. And to me, they are the two main groups driving such a boom in Brazil and internationally. And so I want to cover aspects of when and how it started, what are the main causes and consequences of it, and finally, to go back to the question of cultural appropriation or last salvation, or even both. So in anthropological terms, one could refer to indigenous spiritualities as shamanism. On such a word has been used to define ancient spiritual practices of different indigenous cultures. And while indigenous spiritual beliefs and practices can vary significantly among different groups and across regions, there are common elements and uses to indigenous spiritualities. And they could be interpreted as the spiritual beliefs and practices that indigenous peoples identify as being traditional or customary. It is directly related to their way of living, their way to relate to the land, to their knowledge, and what have been called the other than human beings around them, which are commonly perceived by indigenous peoples as imbued with spirit and animated. So some of these elements, and one could say uses of indigenous spiritualities, involve the language, their chants that many times are used for praying as well as their way of communicating to the spiritual world. Their rituals, their medicines, animism, which is this belief that this other than human beings have anima, their art, cosmologies, dreams, diets, and others. So moving to the Yawanawa and Hunniquen, the Hunniquen are also known as Kaxinawa, and both of them, they belong to the Pano linguistic family that inhabits the tropical forests of Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. And in this presentation, I will speak from a Brazilian perspective. I've been working with the groups from Brazil. So Yawa means white leopard peccary, Queixada, and Nawa means people. So they are known as the people of Queixada. And Huni means human, and Queen means true. So the Hunniquen are known as the true human. And both groups are hunter and gatherers, and in such societies, there is no distinction between spirituality and the rest of subsistence and culture of life. It's almost like everything in their practices is embedded in rituals. So although today the most notable aspects of their shamanism is healing, in the past the shaman's functions were more varied and touched upon other aspects such as culture in general, warfare, and hunting. And in terms of healing, they have very similar practices and techniques, which include chants, blowing, praying, and others. So going back in history, both groups were subjects of colonization during the discovery of Brazil, especially when the missionaries came between the 15 and 1700s, but also during the rubber boom between 1880 and 1910. And most of these groups are now and were previously as well based in Acre, the state in Brazil that was one of the main centers of the boom, the rubber boom and latex extraction in the world. So during these times of exploitation, these groups almost lost all their cultures, and their shamanism and their spirituality was nearly extinct. Only at the end of the 20th century, their rights were finally recognized by the Brazilian Constitution in 1988 and their lands demarcated. It was then at the end of the 90s that they have started to recover their practices, and in the first decade of the 2000s, they dedicated their times mainly to recover all these years of colonization, and they started to teach the youth their native languages that was almost dying, their rituals, the use of their medicines, their art, chants, cosmologies, and so on. And one thing that was very important to both groups was the creation of their traditional festival. And the festival would happen normally once a year, and it would be this time of the year that they would dress traditionally, they would do all their practices, spiritual, dancing, singing, playing games. And normally these festivals would be open to non-Indigenous people as well. And it was at that point of time that their cultures started to be fully shared with people from all around the world. So by the second decade of the 2000s, both the Yawanawa and the Huniquin were traveling around the world, especially to the US and Europe, and organizing different retreats as well at their villages back in the forest in partnership with non-Indigenous people. So it is at this point that for me as an anthropologist, and I graduated, my first graduation is in law. So for me, it became a bit blurry if this was a spiritual awakening or a new wave of colonization, another type of colonization. And this is because most of these partnerships between indigenous and non-indigenous people were happening without much protection for the indigenous. And of course, for them, it was a turning point on their history because they were having the opportunity to share the culture, they were recovering all these practices as never in time. But to me, it also felt like a bit like a turning point to the whole planet, because at that moment I've just finished my PhD and I was a bit like kind of depressed about the world, feeling very hopeless in terms of climate change and reducing deforestation. This was the main topics of my PhD studies, and the fact that they were going all around the world sharing their culture actually gave me a bit hope, and that's why I started to wonder if it was this sort of like last salvation, you know, all this interest in their spirituality and all this move coming from them as well, around these different places. And here I want to give special focus to one of their main medicines, which is for me the medicine that is behind as well, such a spiritual boom, which is ayahuasca. And very simply put, ayahuasca is a brew that has been used for millennia by indigenous peoples, and its use is expanding all around the world. And indeed, it has been showed that it can help with depression, anxiety, changing environmental behavior, and other different things. And there are now more than 200 companies investing on research about it. So it became this sort of like multi-million market. So what about cultural appropriation? It is a fact now that their medicines, especially ayahuasca, is helping a lot of people, and it's been changing our relationship as well with the rest of nature. And to many, the indigenous I work with, they believe we are going through this sort of what they call the spiritual era. We are leaving the material era to move into this spiritual era, and their medicines could be a key for a better future in such a transition. But what are the implications of this in practice to them? And here I'll share a story, because I was worried a lot about cultural appropriation at some point, and then I asked an elder, Yawanawa elder, about his opinion, and he said, we knew this was going to happen. Our ancestors always told us that one day the white people would come and ask us about the medicines, and we have a duty to share. They are not ours. They are a gift from the forest. And then for me, this was such a strong statement and learning as well. But then he complemented, the knowledge is ours, and this is what needs to be recognized. But unfortunately, this recognition is yet to be achieved. And in response to this lack of recognition, indigenous people themselves are organizing different meetings and different ways to sort of like fight for this recognition. And one important outcome of such process is the Indigenous Conference on Ayahuasca. The 4th edition happened last year, and it's just with indigenous participants from all around South America, and they debate many different issues. And according to the letter that came out from the last indigenous conference, in their view, traditional and modern sciences and knowledge need to actually hold hands so we can really achieve the transformation we need for keeping our species alive and transitioning into a more sustainable future. So in terms of rights, indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their biocultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and cultural expressions in accordance with different regulations already in force, such as ILO 169 and the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. But indigenous spiritual attributes for the use of traditional practices and medicines have yet to be recognized. And a practical consequence of this situation is that, for example, indigenous people face a lot of difficulties in transporting their medicines. Even in Brazil, where it's legal to go around with the medicines, they have difficulties as well. And when you think that some ayahuasca religious groups, such as the União do Vegetal and Daime, are able to actually send their medicines internationally, for example, you realize how unfair this is with indigenous people. And another important example of what's going on is what's happening with the psychedelics research and the psychedelic renaissance. There is this modern tendency of scientists to view ayahuasca as primarily a vehicle for making DMT orally active. And while such a framing is actually easier in terms of thinking of the Western science thinking, it obscures the diversity of ayahuasca practices and the oranges of it. A concept, for example, more directly related with indigenous practices would be medicine or master spirit, master teaching spirit, instead of molecule, psychedelic, substance, or whatever name we as scientists put on it. And finally, the ayahuasca globalization has also led to non-indigenous people using indigenous medicines and practices without respecting ethical principles. So I have already witnessed different cases in which a non-indigenous people earns more money, for example, than the indigenous in situations like retreats abroad, or even when it's in the forest. So, and in many of these cases, most of these cases, the indigenous is the one in the group doing most of the work, bearing all the spiritual work that is done, and also the risks of transporting the medicines around the world and so on. And it's the one there that is making less money from it. So considering this this demand in terms of the medicalization of ayahuasca and all that is happening as well around the world, if we don't have the adequate regulation for all these situations, it can be really harmful to indigenous peoples. So in response to it, some indigenous peoples have recently published an article to guide psychedelic research and practice. And they've established what they have called the 8 R's, which is reverence, respect, responsibility, relevance, regulation, reparation, restoration, and reconciliation for their knowledge. And when looking at my ethnographic data from the Hunniquin and Yawanawa trajectories, it became evident that not just the indigenous medicines, but mainly their rituals provide this space for transformation. And this is because they are especially concerned with things that we cannot see, we cannot describe, just experience. Sorry. So in terms of conclusions, for me, it is very important to support indigenous people, to keep their practices sacred. And if they are shared, used, and replicated, we need to do that according to the original values and rights of indigenous people. And for this to happen, I think it's first important to recognize the rights and their knowledge, to address the roots of colonial engagements with indigenous peoples and the issues that generate these hierarchies and hierarchical relations, and this sort of like extraction relation as well. And this requires a healthy confrontation of cultures and aimed at the deconstruction of this sort of like hegemonic power relations. And the issues of access to traditional knowledge also can cause tensions, but these tensions sometimes they are productive, they are constructive. So I think when we approach this sort of differences in a way that we can construct together, we can co-create and articulate these different interests and motivations, then something really good can emerge. And finally, we need to remember that consensuses are processes. They are not like predefined states, so they are also co-created. So I'll leave you with this quote from Anna Shalinka, talking about ayahuasca. And he says that this is how nature talks, because in nature there is God, and God talks to us in our visions. When a shaman drinks his plant brew, the spirits present themselves to him and explains everything. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.